Hello to all my enlightened and eager to learn listeners out there in the ether. As always, it is my privilege to sit before you today and pontificate on high about all the issues of the day that may affect our great country in particular, and of course the world at large, as we try to make sense of all the nonsense which is quite frankly piling up very high. If you're listening to me for the first time, greetings. You are listening to the 26th installment of the Patriot Preacher. I'm Charles Wells, and I am the Patriot Preacher. So, my dear friends, it is truly a sad day in Canada as it appears that the valiant efforts of the Canadian truckers who were standing up against government tyranny has been shut down at the end of a gun when armed police officers broke into truckers' windows, shoved, and ultimately arrested more than 100 protesters in front of the Parliament in Canada, Ottawa, Canada, in a show of force that was spurred by Prime Minister Trudeau, invoking a never-used emergency act to give the government expanded powers to basically and definitively squash the defiant group of truckers. Now, I'm sure you've already formed, some sort of opinion of these folks, depending on what side of the political aisle you're on. But I have to say that people from both sides of the aisle are beginning to wake up and be more unified in opposing governmental intervention around the world that is using this pandemic to overreach their authority in an attempt to have more control over our lives. These protests began back in earlier this month as truck drivers from all over Canada parked their big rigs in the middle of intersections in several Canadian cities, often bringing life and business to a virtual standstill in those areas. The truckers' demands? Well, very simple. For all the mask and vaccination mandates to be ended for their industry, as they should be. After all, 2 years of social distancing, mask mandates and vaccination mandates and shutdowns, what we've discovered is that the only thing that government is good at is basically their ability to take people's freedoms, run their businesses, and to terrify their citizens. The convoy of truck drivers departed British Columbia on January 22nd of this year, en route to Ottawa, which is, of course, Canada's capital, to protest vaccine mandates that were implemented by Mr. Trudeau's government for truckers who travel to the United States and then re-enter Canada. Since the trucker protests began, it has sparked a broader revolt of common everyday people to stand firm against pandemic restrictions more broadly. They have basically been the catalyst, I guess you could say, for people to stand against government overreach and tyranny. Now, Mr. Trudeau initially dismissed the trucker occupation of major city routes as kind of a small fringe minority, since about 90% of all the truckers were already vaccinated, and because there is significant percentage of Canadians that had at least initially supported the public health measures intended to slow down the spread of the virus. But this relatively small but extraordinarily determined group of protesters, their influence rapidly spread. Truck drivers began similar protests in other cities to include Toronto, Quebec City, and Calgary, to include blocking the Ambassador Bridge to Detroit, which is a vital link for the automobile industry. They were well organized and were prepared to be in it for the long haul, if you pardon the pun. They resolved to not stand still or stand down until the mandates had been removed. And rather than even taking the time to understand what the truckers believed in or stood for, Mr. Trudeau resorted to name-calling. The politician went on to assert that he had personally attended protests himself when he agreed with the goals being fought for, such as those championed by Black Lives Matter, but summarily dismissed the truckers' dissent, which was spurred by the administration's own policies, as he characterized them as racist and violent. Now, I believe that Mr. Trudeau, as with many other leftists, has simultaneously underestimated and misunderstood this movement. After all, why would these truckers put their livelihoods on the line when most truckers are already vaccinated? The answer is quite simple. This wasn't just about vaccine mandates. This is a symptom of a greater disease. These people are sparking a wider grassroots movement of people who are tired of government reaching deeply into their personal lives in an unprecedented fashion, at least in modern democratic times. And unlike incendiary and socially destructive organizations like Black Lives Matter, and Antifa, whose overarching goals are to overthrow democracies and replace them with a socialistic or communistic system that uses race as a weapon to achieve what they want, which is, by the way, right out of the playbook of Karl Marx. These truckers, with a few exceptions, were truly peaceful and comprised mostly of hardworking, middle-income people of all races, and they were protesting nonviolently in the spirit of what Martin Luther King Jr. advocated as an avenue for not only change, but coming together as one citizenry, for what is truly right and wrong for all people. And then, of course, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau on February 14th took the unprecedented step of declaring a national public order emergency wholly aimed at stopping the protests. Now, Mr. Trudeau's move to formally declare the emergency by invoking the Emergencies Act was the first time the Canadian government has taken such action in half a century. They didn't even do this on 9/11. And his most aggressive response yet since this whole manufactured crisis began. What this means is that the national government in Canada was given sweeping powers to freeze the bank accounts of the truckers and those who support them as well. A GoFundMe page that had raised more than $10 million to support the truckers' endeavor to end these nonsensical restrictions was shut down. Under the additional powers allowed by invoking the Emergencies Act, the government can also revoke the truckers' driver's licenses and registrations, and even go so far as to seize their trucks. You know, when we get to the point where peaceful protests are answered by seizing people's personal properties, we are indeed treading very closely to the line of tyrannical behavior. After all, how successful would the civil rights movement in the 1960s have been in our own nation if the U.S. government would have been allowed to have the ability to seize people's properties and freeze their assets, to include anyone who assisted them? And as is common with leftists, Trudeau continues to divide his country by doubling down on the dictates as he accuses conservative members of Canada's own parliament of standing with swastikas. Without remorse or apology, his inflammatory rhetoric only served to galvanize people's resolve in resisting government overreach. The truckers' cause had spread beyond the initial boundaries, and much more so as Mr. Trudeau moved forward to forcibly quell their free speech and characterize them in ways that are wholly untrue. It always amazes me how leftists will continue to stroll down whatever path they're going down, no matter how unpopular that path may be or how destructive it is for the very people they claim to be serving. For me, this behavior is proof that they maintain a level of hubris and outright arrogance that few of us here at the bottom would ever dare to entertain in our own personal or professional lives. What is going on in Canada right now has a direct connection to us, by the way. It is a litmus test, if you will, on how effective that Martin Luther King-like passive resistance will hold up in today's politically violent world that is rife with tyrannical politicians waiting in the wings to complete the conquest of human dignity and freedom. If the truckers can be definitively put down with force, if their livelihoods are taken from them, if their bank accounts and assets are frozen, as those are who are adamantly supporting them, if their trucks and other personal property can be truly be seized by government, then it doesn't bode well for us here in America. As I've stated many times before in previous videos, democracy and all of the institutions that embrace and nurture it are a delicate and rare commodity in the history of the world. Human history is rife with tyrannical oppressors who have always claimed to have their best interest in mind. Everything has always been done for our own good, if we would just be able to see that. But all roads of subjugation and absolute control, without any sort of boundaries, have always headed down the same road and, quite frankly, always will. In other words, don't forget what happened to our brothers and sisters in Canada. The Canadian truckers will stand up as a future case study in human liberty and how to stand up against, for lack of a better word, bullies. As organized and well-funded as they were, their ultimate failure is not a good sign of how well the rest of us will fare in our bid to keep freedom alive as we run headlong in a socialistic race that will ultimately culminate in us being the subjects of a one world government. Now, I know. Many of you probably think I'm presenting hyperbole, or at least the very best exaggerating the importance of this event. But if you really think about what I'm saying, or if you think what I'm being over the top, I want you to think about this. There are only two paths that any nation can possibly take. Either we are heading toward a future where there is more individual freedoms and rights to determine our own destiny, or we're heading toward a future where there's less of those freedoms and rights. There's no alternative, really. There's no in-between path. Freedom and the loss of it has a momentum of its own, especially when a country forgets its place in history. Maintaining our course on the correct path of freedom and righteousness requires people to stand up against tyranny, and once they have, it is up to us, even more of us, to support them fully and wholeheartedly. It is as the old saying goes, that freedom is not free. The perpetuation of freedom, as in the maintenance of anything of value in this life, requires conscious effort and resolve. Look, it's really very simple. If people don't stand up, our great republic will falter, fall, and ultimately fail. And it's going to fail catastrophically when it does. It is our sacred duty to ensure this doesn't happen on our watch, and to teach our children how not to allow it on their watch. Well, folks, it's once again time for me to step away from my proverbial political pulpit, if you can forgive the unintentional alliteration. I hope that my thoughts and words on this particular subject has resonated with you to the point where you might consider supporting groups like these Canadian truckers in the future, who have made great sacrifices for a common cause that we all have, and risking everything to include their livelihoods to do it. And unlike our Marxist brothers and sisters, they're really doing it for the common good. You know, one last word to my brothers and sisters who are espoused Democrats. I know that it's difficult to change long-held beliefs and allegiances to organizations you've long been a part of. That is the reason I describe myself as a conservative rather than a public Republican. But I urge you to take the time to really dissect where the Democratic Party is heading, to study history, and to be introspective about your own beliefs to see if they still line up with who you are supporting. Liberalism, after all, is a philosophy, while being a Democrat is blindly giving your loyalty to a political mechanism which may no longer reflect your values or what you believe as a human being. My channel has been growing as of late, and I thank you for that. I hope that you will help me spread the good news of logic and common sense that our Creator has gifted to us. If you have enjoyed the subject we have broached today, I would greatly appreciate it if you would take the time to get notifications, make pertinent comments, agreeing or disagreeing, and ultimately to hit that little subscribe button at the bottom right-hand corner, so that we can further develop a relationship with one another and hopefully have some great conversations. Until next time, I wish you and your families good fortune, good health, and help us through these tumultuous times. Goodbye, and God bless.